Chair recognizes Mr. Moskowitz for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And thank you for holding this hearing today on pandemic response, waste, fraud, and abuse. I think we can agree on a bipartisan basis that, of course, we want to find out about waste, fraud, and abuse, because in the emergency management business, one of the things we do after a disaster is we do after-action reviews, and we look at what went right and what went wrong to not repeat those same mistakes. And so, when the country began, and we're facing an unprecedented whole-of-country crisis, the first 50-state disaster in American history. Every state had a disaster declaration at the same time. The Trump administration was ill-prepared, and in fact, several times wanted the states to take the lead instead of the federal government, specifically when it came to PPE. And so we've heard a lot about fraud and abuse today. I want to focus on the waste. It's not as sexy as fraud and abuse, but the amount of waste that happened during the pandemic, especially in the PPE space, is something that I want to discuss. That void that was created when the states had to step up and procure all these resources, the states had to compete against everybody but Antarctica, but most importantly, the federal government. And while the federal government was raising prices, companies were price gouging the federal government, while the federal government was not following their own procurement. In fact, $18 billion was spent by the Trump administration procuring these goods. $10 billion of that did not go through procurement. It was sole-sourced contracts. And so one of the things I want to talk about as the former director of emergency management for the state of Florida for Governor DeSantis is, did the Inspector General's office, and this question is for you, Mr. Horowitz, did the Inspector General's office ever look at anyone within the inner circle at the White House on whether they were involved in specifically selecting vendors and negotiating pricing for PPE?
So each Inspector General has authority by law in the IG Act over the employees in their building, in their agency. We do not have authority to investigate individuals outside, and there is no Inspector General for the Executive Office of the President or the White House.
Okay, I appreciate that. So let's switch over to the GAO then. Has the GAO examined whether anyone within Trump's inner circle, including family members, were involved in decisions on who should get what contracts and the $10 billion that didn't go through procurement and the pricing that was paid for all sorts of different PPE, whether that be masks or ventilators? I mean, trust me, I've read all of the stuff, but I just want to know, did you guys specifically look at any of that?
No, we did not.
Okay. So what if I proffered for you that when states could not get this PPE out of FEMA or out of HHS, that we had to call the White House to get this stuff released directly from his inner circle? What if I proffered for you? Would that sound like normal procurement process during an emergency?
Probably not.
Right. So, one of the questions that I think we should focus on, Mr. Chairman, in this hearing is that COVID was not a 2-year event. It was a 3-year event. And I am more than happy to join with the majority and look at the fraud and abuse that went on in the last 2 years in COVID-related programs. But I think it's only fair for us to also look at the beginning of the disaster and the amount of government waste that existed by the federal government sole sourcing contracts and negotiating pricing within the White House, subverting the process from federal agencies. Because not only did that drive up cost and waste, that filtered down to the other 50 states. Because if the federal government was paying more money and I wanted to buy those supplies, I had to pay more money. So it isn't just the $18 billion that was spent here, it's the money now that FEMA has to reimburse those states for goods that were too expensive because the federal government drove up those prices. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Ms. Luna for 5 minutes.
New at this. I just want to thank the chairman and all of the witnesses for participating. I know it's been a long day, so I'll try to keep this short. COVID improper payments continue to be an area of concern that the federal government due to lack of oversight from the Biden administration. As Representative Boebert had stated, estimates range as high as $560 billion of government COVID spending was subject to fraud, waste, and abuse. That's our hard-earned taxpayer dollars that could have been used to feed families, heat homes, and fill up the pump during the Biden-caused inflation crisis. President Biden continued to approve COVID spending with no guardrails in place to make sure that the money was going where it was intended to go. We have seen the federal government spending and distributing to illegal immigrants. These same illegal immigrants, mind you, that did not take or pass the health screening process for legal immigrants to come here. And in addition to that, they did not pay into our taxpayer system. I would like to submit the graphic into record. We can see that the city of Chicago is sending $71 million for financial assistance for underserved communities such as undocumented residents. The state of Washington is handing out $340 million in grant payments for immigrants or illegal immigrants who are not otherwise eligible for federal stimulus. And the city of Boston is sending $1 million in direct cash transfers to illegal immigrants who are unable to receive federal COVID benefits. This rewards a dangerous process, incentivizing people to come here illegally, where some have estimated that a shocking 60% of Latin American children who cross the border, largely because they are seeking the American dream and understand some of the benefits people offer in this country, are caught by cartels, exploited for child pornography and drug trafficking. These are not cherry-picked fact or distorted figures. This is actually happening. My question is for Mr. Horowitz. If illegal immigrants are prohibited from federal public benefits, then why are they allowed to receive federal COVID dollars from programs like the American Rescue Plan?
I would have to go back and look at each program and what was how eligibility determinations were made and who was eligible. And I'm happy to follow up with you and provide information to you. We're looking at anybody who's ineligible. Frankly, we don't break it down between the categories as to why. So we're looking for people who are ineligible. We're working with our law enforcement partners on that. Whether you're here legally, not here legally, you really own the business, or you never owned a business, we're going to follow up and pursue that.
Before I yield back my time real quick, I just want to put out there that obviously being a part of oversight, we want to ensure that our taxpayer dollars are being safeguarded, right? But also, too, that government funds are not being used to largely incentivize and hurt people in the process. And so just to finalize, and maybe just your personal opinion, do you believe that because of this type of inappropriate spending, that it is putting people in harm's way that would potentially not be subject to this victimization?
So, as I said earlier, I don't think we've heard testimony that these programs weren't helpful to individuals. In fact, for many of them, like the PPP program, we've heard from small businesses that it saved them. For restaurants and the restaurant revitalization program, for unemployment insurance, we heard testimony about how it kept people afloat during this period. So we haven't heard testimony that the programs were a waste and useless. What we heard was there was a lack of preparation to issue the benefits. It resulted in fraud, a lot of identity fraud. And what we have heard is from how it victimized not just the public who lost the benefit of these programs to wrongdoers, it harmed the person whose identity was stolen. That individual has to deal with that. And it often harmed the individual who's intended to benefit, because they often struggle to get the benefits because the fraudster got there first.
Thank you.
And programs thought they were the fraudster.
Thank you. And before I leave, Chairman, would you please submit the record for the graphic for record? Thank you.
Without objection. And thank you for your questions. Just a note, they just called floor votes. We're going to get 2 more questioners in, then we'll recess and reconvene 10 minutes after votes. There are only 2 votes, and we move a lot quicker than Pelosi did. So the recess won't take long. But now the chair recognizes Mr. Conley for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. And welcome, Mr. Dodaro, Mr. Horowitz. Welcome back. Ms. Smith, welcome to the committee. My questions are going to be to you, Mr. Dodaro, and you, Mr. Horowitz. On On Monday, the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, led by you, Mr. Horowitz, released a fraud alert that found fraudsters used nearly 70,000 questionable Social Security numbers to obtain as much as $5.4 billion from SBA's Paycheck Protection Program. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the fraud could have been stopped if the federal government invested in appropriate data analytics capacity and focused on sharing that data across agency silos and among various levels of government. Is that a fair
That's
assessment?
correct.
Would you agree with that, Mr. Dodaro?
Absolutely.
So, based on previous conversations we've had about improper payments and trying to curb that, which this committee's been talking about for a long time, and has been a high-risk category for GAO for a long time as well, I introduced the Stop Fraud Act that, in fact, would, by statute, do just that. It would have used data analytics and would have propagated data analytics information sharing across federal agencies, a desirable goal that could very well have curbed or prevented the fraud we're concerned about. And the bill would also create a center of excellence to look at best practices and to try to assist other agencies in achieving those goals. Unfortunately, not a single Republican co-sponsored that bill. Today's hearing concern notwithstanding. So I would invite the chairman, Mr. Comer, maybe to take a second look at the Stop Fraud Act, and maybe we can, as he indicated yesterday, his desire and the desirability of cooperating on a bipartisan basis. I do think Stop Fraud Act has real bipartisan potential, and I would welcome Mr. Comer joining me in that effort. But I do think that there are steps we can take and could have and should have taken that might have made a difference. Mr. Dodaro, would you like to comment on that?
I have, since 2015, recommended the permanent creation of a data analytics capacity to support the IG community. It's had its proven value, and I was very disappointed that the Treasury Department did not pick up that option that Congress gave them to take over the Recovery Operations Center, existing capacity. And I was also disappointed that Congress didn't act on my recommendation back in 2015.
Right.
But better late than never. And so I hope that Congress does pass that. I think it will have tremendous proven value and return many more dollars than the investment. But it has to be made permanent so it's ready to go at any time.
Yeah, absolutely. Mr. Horowitz, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, I just say ditto at some level, but I'd remind, as you know, and remind Congress, the ROC was created with tens of millions of dollars in taxpayer money. It was very effective. It went away in 2015. We had to start from scratch in 2021 with a new appropriation from Congress and more money. We would have had we not only wouldn't have had to do that, but I bet we would have found some wrongdoing, fraud, and other recoveries in that intervening 5 years between the two disasters, because there were other disaster relief programs.
And I guess the final point I'd pick up on, and you testified to this earlier, Mr. Dodaro, it's the culture too. What's rewarded? What's rewarded is pushing money out the door and funding programs and having metrics that show how many people you've helped and reached, all worthwhile goals. But what's not really rewarded comparably is, and I saved $4 billion. I avoided fraud. I took measures to make sure it couldn't happen. And we have to change that culture. And I'm hoping this piece of legislation is a big step in that direction. But I think your point is very well taken.
Yeah.
And I yield back.
Yeah, and actually, the other culture that has to be corrected, if I may, Mr. Chairman, is to make it clear to agencies, management of the programs, that prevention of fraud is their responsibility. It's not just the auditors coming in later, the investigators, the Secret Service, whoever. because unless it's prevented up front, it's not really going to be totally successful. We'll always need to have investigations afterwards, but unless that culture shifts to the agency management and Congress holds them accountable, you're not going to really be as successful as we all want to be.
Thank you, and before we yield back, I'd like to comment, we're going to hold these agencies accountable. That day starts today. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from the Inspector General of the Social Security Administration dated January 31st, 2023. This letter described various activities that that office has undertaken with respect to COVID fraud, notably in relation to the misuse of Social Security numbers, which is an issue at the heart of what you all have discussed today and many COVID fraud schemes. This letter also points out that the Social Security IG has never dedicated funds for oversight. He's never received dedicated funds for oversight. This is another step Democrats could have taken in the American Rescue Plan, but chose not to. So without objection, we'll enter this into the record. Our last questioner before recess, Mr. Fallon from Texas.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Horowitz, we're hearing a lot of testimony, and would it be fair to say that we're talking about billions of dollars in fraud?
Correct.
Could be tens, could be hundreds of billions of dollars. The fact of the matter is, I think we're discussing the largest case of fraud in the history of the United States. And frankly, this might be the largest case of fraud in human history, as we've known about these extremes since early 2021. And it's absolutely an embarrassment to this institution, to the executive branch, to all the federal agencies involved. The United States government has been swindled by not only our own people, but criminals in Russia, in China, Romania, and Nigeria, to name a few. It's estimated that 40% of pandemic unemployment assistance funds, about $400 billion in taxpayer money, went to criminal organizations and authoritarian regimes like Russia and China. Just to put this into perspective, according to the World Bank, there are 194 recognized countries on Earth, and 171 of them don't even have annual GDPs that rise to that level of $560 billion. To add insult to injury, Democrats did not hold not one full committee hearing and oversight last Congress on COVID-19 fraud, which begs the question, what is this committee even for? Quite frankly, it's for a hearing just like this, when a potential amount of $500 billion has been stolen. And what did the Democrats do instead of investigating rampant COVID fraud? They used the reconciliation process to ram through $1.9 trillion of spending in the form of the American Rescue Plan Act that continued to fund broken programs we knew were systemically fraudulent. So I ask again, what did the Democrats do for 2 years in oversight instead of investigating the largest fraud in history? Well, they held hearings on the dangers of flea and tick collars for pets, whether or not the Postal Service could handle packages during the holidays, the developments in state cannabis laws, and potential bipartisan reefer reform. They made villains out of CEOs of the critical and essential American energy sector, who are the most effective and most efficient in the world at extracting natural resources. In fact, they help guarantee our national security. So I wonder if Democrats considered if their massive spending and barring federal land leases and permits for drilling had anything to do with the 40-year high in energy prices we've seen. They held hearings on protecting the free speech of environmentalist activists and others that agree with them, while at the same time celebrating censorship of those who didn't share their views. And get this, they hosted 2 depositions, 1 roundtable, and 1 full committee hearing on the Washington Redskins, or Commanders, whatever they're called nowadays. And why? Because somebody had a bee in their bonnet about Daniel Snyder. We had hearings to tell us, believe it or not, that pollution is racist. The weather, racist. Climate change, racist. COVID-19, by definition, an indiscriminate virus, was racist. Maternal health care, you guessed it, racist. And America itself, the land of opportunity and prosperity, where millions of people come to this country every year, both legally and illegally, to live their dream. Many Democrats told us for 2 years that America is systemically and irrevocably racist, that white privilege runs amok. Fortunately, the hard data proves this leftist talking point to be categorically false. And the list of useless hearings goes on and on. Plain and simple, the last 2 years were an egregious dereliction of duty and a waste. So it is, Mr. Chairman, with tremendous delight and relish that I see this committee actually and actively tackling serious matters of import to our country and our citizens. Like, for instance, criminal transnational organized crime stealing $500 billion from the American Treasury and, by extension, the American taxpayers' very pockets. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. We are going to now, without objection, go into recess, and we'll reconvene 10 minutes after the last vote. We only have 2 votes, which won't be long. I know we have about 8 or 9 more questioners and then a second panel. So without objection, we're in recess until 10 minutes after conclusion of the last vote.